Okay, today we're going to be looking at uh, chapter 9. I'm going to share a page with you. Just like we saw with uh, chapter 7, we're looking at, let's see, producer and consumer surplus. And then we went into uh, breaking it down with taxes involved, with producer consumer surplus, uh, the taxes to the government. We could determine that amount as well. Plus, we saw the dead weight loss. And anytime we have a situation like that, it is a market failure. Now, in the case that we're looking at in chapter 9, we can still see the consumer and producer surplus. We have an equilibrium price and quantity. But what we're going to introduce here is what we call the world price. And when we see the world price, we can see this world price is above equilibrium. So being above equilibrium, if we look at this point right here, this is the number of sellers that can produce a product at least break even. In our domestic market, the way it was looking, this group right here did not exist. Well, they existed, but they were not willing to sell the product at that price range. Now, when the world price goes up, now they have a market for their goods. So this group right here is going to enter the marketplace. So we're going to add sellers. To the equation. Now this is going to result in exports. Now the consumers with world price, the American consumers are going to do what? This will be their domestic quantity demanded right here. The quantity supplied domestic is going to be here because those sellers enter the market. But those products are going to be exported. Or some of the total product all the way from 0 to here. We don't know which company is going to do the shipping or delivering the exports, but there will be product that is exported at that price. When we looked at it before, with consumer surplus, A and B represented consumer surplus. That'd be, 1 second, before trade, A and B, after trade, A. Oh, that's just consumer plus. Yeah, AB would be consumer. A after trade is consumer. So we lose B. Producer surplus is C, but producer surplus goes up to A, B, and D. So this whole area becomes producer surplus. Okay? Not different from what we saw before. Now, in the U.S., the consumer is going to look at it as a market failure. But internationally, we're just finding a new equilibrium. That's all we're doing. Now, if it's below equilibrium, we'll have new consumers enter the marketplace. We'll have new consumers here. We'll have plus buyers. So we'll add buyers, but we're going to lose sellers. Now, what's going to happen, those new buyers are going to request additional goods from the marketplace. And that's this area right here. They're going to request additional goods at that price. This will be the quantity supplied domestic. This will be the quantity supplied by international producers. So if you're in a country and you can sell T-shirts for 10, in the United States it costs 15. If you can get them in here at 10, you can definitely build up your sales. Any questions about the two options, either above or below? Just remember, if it's above equilibrium, if the price is greater than equilibrium, the world price is greater than equilibrium. As far as this is concerned, with world price, there's exports. Here is below, and we have imports. When you see these on the test, the way you can eliminate any confusion between the graphs we saw in chapter 8 and chapter 9 is, does it say world price? If it says world price, it's in chapter 9. The main thing we're looking at is what the world price is in comparison to the domestic price. Here they do give us another breakdown. You'll see some of these on the test and on the homework where they want you to identify each area. The consumer surplus. We have a world price that is way lower than what we see at equilibrium. But the big difference here is the government comes in on this equation. They add a tariff. We see it right here. So if the world price is here, this will be the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied by the American producers. All the rest of this will be imported from outside. If there's a tariff put in place that raises the price, we now see the number of buyers fall. We see that go inward. And the quantity being supplied by the domestic suppliers will increase. So when the government puts a tariff on there, several things happen. One, they get revenue, which is what we see in E. So revenue. D and F will be deadweight loss. We can see that noted here. The D and F will be deadweight loss because we will see that increase, but a lot of the supplies can be still coming from abroad. You can see the product from here to here with the new sellers that are entering the marketplace. They can enter here without penalty if they're domestic suppliers. And it gets this price back closer to this equilibrium. Now, if it goes above the equilibrium, then all of the American suppliers are going to be shipping them overseas. But this is a good one to have available to you. In fact, all these graphs will be good to have printed out and available when you start taking the test. So you can break down all these key points. Okay? Any questions on these four graphs? Any at all?
No, sir.
If you have any questions and you don't want to speak up, you can just text them and chat, put it in the chat area. Okay, let's go away from this one. This is chapter 9 as well. The first graph we looked at, we had equilibrium without trade. So quantity supply equal to quantity demand. The consumer gets what they want at a given price, and the seller can sell what they want at a given price in the marketplace. We have both consumer producer surplus. This is the exact same graph we saw in the other example. Here's ask the expert: past major trade deals have benefited most Americans. 93% of economists agree. I don't know where the 7%, because in this slide, the key word that gets these economists to agree is most. It doesn't say all, it just says most. Now, this 7% is trying to figure out who the most are. That's another study all in itself. But most trade deals will benefit us. It could allow product to come in that we don't normally see in the marketplace, but it can also allow imports of goods that are less expensive, therefore reducing the price to the consumer. Now, when we, just like we saw with those graphs, we're looking at a situation where here the world price is above the equilibrium. That'll determine how many units will be sold in the marketplace. Just remember, if the world price is high, the number of units demanded will be reduced in the domestic marketplace. And we saw that with this graph here. The domestic quantity demanded will fall. Now, the domestic quantity supply will increase because businesses are going to take care of that additional need at that higher price. Now, here it asks, should tariff be a part of the trade policy if necessary? And it's also determined based on what is the desired outcome of this trade. If it's to help the underdeveloped trading partners expand their economies, you may not want to do the tariff, or you can reduce the tariff to a point where they are competitive with other markets in other countries. But that's all part of the negotiations here. If you look at the European Union, they eliminated all borders and the cost of trade between these countries in Europe. So in essence, they created one huge marketplace. And Great Britain's in the process of getting out of it now. The world price is the price of good that prevails in the world market for that good. And domestic is what's here. If we were in France, that would be so many francs or so many euros. The price would be lower or higher. That's all. It doesn't matter which country you're in. You look at the domestic price is what they can produce, and the world price is what the world can produce and at what price. That will determine the imports and exports. Compare domestic price with world price. He said we're consumers. And if we see a situation where the world price is below if the world price is below we're going to import those goods, and the consumer's going to appreciate that additional product at the lower cost. Now, compare domestic price with world price, determine comparative advantage. If domestic price is less than world price, we export the good. If domestic is greater, we import. So that's all we're doing, is looking at the equilibrium and where the world price lines up with that equilibrium. Now, tariffs, if we were to add a tariff to this, all we would do, if we added a tariff, now, if the tariff was placed on something like this, and it'd have to be an export tax of some sort, we would see a decrease in the number of domestic buyers to here. This would be deadweight loss, and this is what we pay to the government for shipping it out, and this would be the quantity demanded internationally at that higher price. Or that'll be the quantity supplied. But that'll be a trade on exporting items. So if we look at oil and we decide to help balance the national debt, and we place a $2 a barrel export tax on oil. So any oil going outside, now what will happen is the world price and equilibrium they're gonna change as well. But it's just like this, it's adding a tariff on the backside on trade. Exporting country, we look at domestic equilibrium price before trade is below the world price. Once the trade is allowed, domestic prices rise equal to the world price. Quantity supply is greater than domestic quantity demanded. So we have a surplus of goods, and the difference is exports. Those products will go elsewhere. Just like we see here, there's the basic chart we saw before. Exporting country, before international trade, we look at consumer produced surplus. With international trade, we'll have smaller consumer surplus and higher producer surplus. So the producer surplus will go to here, B, C, and D, where the consumer plus would move from A, B, D to just A, and B and D would be transferred over to the producer surplus. Because all these are domestic companies trying to produce the goods. Exporting country before international trade. Okay. The domestic producers are better off because they're selling goods at the higher price. There's more. If we go back to 7, and we look at the individual businesses that enter the marketplace going up and down that supply curve. If we go back to this original number, the individuals from zero quantity to here were at or below, the price was at or above what it costs to produce it. Because we have new businesses entering all through here. Now we're having these businesses enter the marketplace. They don't receive any benefit from what was down here, but the individuals that were along this supply curve are now being able to sell that product at above cost on the international markets. So they are definitely better off. This group, they're just new entries. And if you are in this price level and what you can sell the product for, you can produce it, but you don't have any profits. However, if you were down on this scale and your price to produce the good was in here, you have profits available to you. Once trade is allowed, the domestic price drops. Domestic quantity demand is decreased. We saw that because it moves from here, the original equilibrium, to here. So there are winners on both sides, but not on all three. The domestic consumer will probably see the greatest pressure, negative pressure. The world will see better or more product. The supplier is going to be happy they're selling more product. So the burden will be on the consumer. Here we see a world price below equilibrium, where it used to be C, B, and D were producer surplus before trade with world. A was the consumer surplus. That has completely changed now with the world price being below equilibrium. We have individuals that were once willing to buy the product at this price, but because of the trade, the number of consumers are going to be right in here. I'm going backwards. I'm getting my coffee. This is additional consumers here. They're going to enter the marketplace because of a lower price. So here the consumer is going to be the winner with a greater consumer surplus, and the producer is going to lose. We'll only have X number of sellers willing to supply the product at that price, but that void will be filled by imports from other countries. As long as we perceive the quality of the product to be equal or above or near, we would go for the lower price. The imported country, before international trade, we have just basic consumer producer surplus. With international trade, higher consumer surplus, smaller producer surplus, and higher total surplus. This is stuff we've already talked about. Now, tariffs. A tariff is a tax on goods produced abroad and sold domestically. So things coming in. And that one protects American suppliers because it allows some more to participate in the marketplace. It also grants revenue to the government, but the loser is the consumer, and we also see the deadweight loss. Now, free trade, that means the domestic price is the world price. As you see in the European Union, there's a world price, but that's outside of their group. But within their group, in their own little world, anything produced in any of those countries is considered domestic. And that would be the EU price. Tariff on imports raises domestic price, but world price by the amount of the tariff. We saw that here. This is the graph, same graph we saw in the first set of slides. We see the deadweight loss here and here. The consumers are going to want to enter at this point, but when that tariff is placed on it, the number of units demanded by the domestic consumer is going to fall. And we can see the number of suppliers falling as well. We've discussed all these. The tariff raises the price. Domestic quantity demand decreases. Domestic quantity demand increases. We can see that in this graph. With the tariff, it brings this price back up to here. So we have additional suppliers that are willing to enter the marketplace at this point. Reduces the quantity of imports. We can see that as well. We went from importing from this point to this point, from here to here. All that would have been imports. Now, when the tariff is put in place, we see the reduction here. So we'll see buyers exit the marketplace, and we'll see suppliers increase. Now it moves it closer to equilibrium. Domestic sellers are better off, domestic buyers are worse off. So when you see a tariff that's put in place in any trade agreement, there will be an adverse impact to the consumer. To what degree? It's all based on how dependent we are on producing those goods and the cost of producing them domestically. Before the tariff, let's see what's going on there. Now with international trade, we see a lot of variety of goods. If you go to a country like North Korea, they don't have many options. They are extremely impoverished. Now, international trade, we can deal with economies of scale, increase competition, enhance flow of ideas, and that has to have limits on it. We have to be able to protect our copyright, trademark positions. So this is an issue we're dealing with China right now. I saw on TikTok, Oracle is intending to handle all the domestic TikTok activities. I don't think it's been approved yet, but it's in the process.
So actually, Oracle said they weren't going to buy it, from what I heard.
Well, I don't think they're going to buy it. I think they're going to be just managing the data. That's what I heard. It was Oracle and was it Microsoft? I'm trying to remember who else was involved. But there's still questions about that because the main company for TikTok is Chinese, and all Chinese companies have to be willing to give everything they have to the military, without question. So that creates some difficulty for the simple purpose. They'll know more about you than you know about yourself in a very short period of time. If you want to find out how much they're collecting, you want to go to Google and try to eliminate your history, or just see it, and you'll have thousands of pages of information that they have compiled about you, and you can delete it if you like. Argument for restricting trade, part one. The domestic producers oppose free trade because there's going to be additional competition to them, especially if the world price is below their domestic price. And they believe the government should protect the domestic industry from foreign competition. Well, we trade with everybody in the world. And by doing so, the American consumer is receiving great benefit from that. Now, the businesses, they want protection. But in a lot of cases, they're wanting protection for their old system. When we had the oil embargo in the 1970s, in the early 80s, everybody that had big cars, all of a sudden, they had all the big domestic, heavy American-made cars. At the time, the American-made cars were designed to last 5 to 7 years. If you saw a car with 100,000 miles on it, it was worn out. 100,000 miles today is just a drop in a bucket. But when the oil embargo took place and everybody wanted small, inexpensive, fuel-efficient vehicles, the U.S. manufacturer couldn't give it to them. It took them about 5 to 7 years from concept to delivery of the product. So even at the beginning of the big shift in demand for the smaller cars, Detroit was 5 to 7 years out to even do anything. But Japan stepped in. Germany stepped in because they had the Volkswagen. And there were a few British small cars that came into the marketplace, but the majority of them started coming in from Japan. Their concept delivery was less than 2 years. So when the American said they wanted a bunch of fuel-efficient cars, they made them. They delivered them. Now, the American automakers, they wanted protection. But they got it to some degree through tariffs. However, the American consumer took a beating because the American producers, the Ford, the Chevy, they didn't change their philosophy of building excellent or quality cars. They just assumed that if the tariff was put on there to where that Toyota costs the same thing as a Ford, people are going to buy the Ford. And the problem was nobody wanted the Ford. So sometimes that protectionism actually prevents companies from changing. What should have happened is if the government did not step in, Ford, Chevy, GM, all of them, they would have been forced to make a lot of tough changes in their system. So sometimes when the government's protecting a company like that or companies, it's not helping the consumers, and in reality, it's not helping the businesses either. Because instead of advancing to the new world system or processes, they just sat there and did the same thing, twiddled their thumbs, waiting for the American consumer to come buy the products. And they didn't come back. Now we can look at the trade thing, and one of the big areas that people focus on is jobs. It destroys domestic jobs. As a student, this was about 20 years ago, sitting on the front row of my class, and he was angry. You could tell he was bitter. And we started talking about trade. He got a little worse. And he was very adamant that this is what should have happened. He was in the textile industry. He had been with the company for 20 some years. And all of a sudden, they pack up and leave. He thought the American government should have protected these jobs. But these were not high-skilled jobs. And there was a lot of mechanization in it, where you had individuals that were just tending the machines and so forth, and packaging and delivering the products. It did impact that company. When other companies started moving across the oceans and to Far East to get product built or produced, that company they had no choice. They had to leave. And when I talked to the individual in the front of the class, he was very angry. In fact, hostile to the people that received or took his job, as if it was the actual worker themselves that caused the problem. Well, I asked the individual how long he had been working with him. It was about 27 years. I asked him where they were located before that, and he said they were up north in Ohio, Pennsylvania, somewhere in that region. And I told him that when that company moved from wherever they were located, either Ohio, Pennsylvania, wherever it was, that there was a person up there that was just as angry at him as he was the person today. Jobs are going to move. Skill sets are going to move. They're going to evolve. Programmers, back in the beginning of the internet era, I mean, anybody that could program, they were highly sought after. I knew some individuals in high school that were writing programs in DOS and other programming languages. They were hired right out of high school just because they knew how to do it. I had the same thing with some community college students that were programmers. Once their name got out there, somebody hired them. Now, when we look at free trade, if it's reciprocal, we may lose jobs, but we will have new jobs become available. So it can create jobs because it can take our product to their market. The national security argument. These are the arguments for against trade. This is one that was put into place in 2016 on steel and aluminum. And the domestic producers of steel had most of them had gone out of business. They were gone. In 2016, it was determined that steel was, if we were ever going to get into a war again, we could not be dependent on the world for our supply of steel. Therefore, we had to protect those markets and those companies. So very high tariffs were placed on imported steel, which increased the number of suppliers of steel because, as we looked at before, when we put that tariff on there, we had more domestic sellers entering the marketplace or coming back in. So this is what the intention was to take this point right here and drive it back up to here. For the purpose of national security. A lot of countries were upset about it. China making huge quantities of steel. Only problem, some of their metallurgy isn't quite as good. And you can see it in some of the products that are you buy, and they come from directly from China, their metallurgy is not real good, or they cut corners to make sure that they can supply the product at a lower cost, be it a nut, or bolt, or a screw, or an automobile. But this was implemented with the new administration in 2016. This was the re-evaluation of NAFTA, the jobs, all those were key points. Infant industry. Let's say that I come up with a new product. Nobody in the world has it. I have the patent or copyright of that product. The government can protect me to allow me to get started, get to where I can develop the product on my own, deliver the product, make a profit, and the government can protect me until I can get to that point. Now, it'd be temporary, because if you can't make a profit without the government paying you to make a profit, when the government goes away, you're going to be a loser. So this is just to get started. Now, I imagine with the increased oil and coal and gas production in the U.S., there were some protections for them as well. And now we see the prices stabilizing out at around 2. I think I paid $178 last week in around Smithfield and Four Oaks. Unfair competition argument. This is the thing that's going on with China right now. One, trademark infringement. You can find Coach bags made in China, and everything's exactly the same. They even use the same name, and the whole purpose is to get you to buy an inferior product at a higher price. That's unfair competition. And the only resolve that a lot of companies have is to go to the U.S. government and have tariffs placed on other products, so the government of China will go in and stop the other from occurring. Now, we could end up with an increase in total surplus for the country, but we have to fight this, and this would go, any arguments in this area would go to the U.S. courts or the World Trade Organization, WTO. It doesn't mean they're going to rule for you. I think there's been some rulings recently for the U.S. as far as unfair trade practices with China, but the problem is China don't care. They will support the WTO as long as the rulings are in their favor. Similar to what happened in the World Health Organization. Even the board members of the World Health Organization went to China. They didn't think coronavirus was a big deal. They also were saying it was not transferable. And this was in January, February. And the whole time, China knew it was. That's unfair competition. China also was hoarding all the PPEs, so they could resell them at a higher price. Now, sometimes we can have restrictions, or we need protections, a bargain chip argument. We put tariffs on a large quantity of China's products, and some of them may have been necessary, some may not have, but they are all part of the bargaining chip. So like if you're going to buy a car, I mean, you go in there and you offer well below what you would be willing to pay. At least you got a starting point. If you got a trade-in they want, That's a bargaining point too. So arguments for restricting trade, protection is a bargaining chip argument. It may not work, it may work. Normally what happens is the other country will be retaliatory. And when we put tariffs and quotas on their products, they would do the same thing to the American products. The majority of the products that we're bringing in from the U.S. were agricultural in nature, so the American farmer was hit pretty hard. Anytime you use this, there's going to be issues with the country you're trading with, and there'll be issues with the individuals that are domestically producing the product. Trade deals. Now this one's worded a little different. Refusing to liberalize trade unless partner countries adopt new labor or environmental rules is a bad policy. Because even if the new standards would reduce distortions on some dimensions, such as policy involves threatening to maintain large distortions in the form of trade, restricted trade. You got 49% agree, 26% uncertain, and 25% disagree. In the original negotiations of NAFTA, and even with the Mexico-Canada-American Trade Agreement, there were groups of individuals that want to implement the same OSHA rules, they want the same EPA standards, they want the same workers' rights. All the labor law, they wanted all this to take place when they were negotiating with Canada and Mexico. Here's the problem. If you got a country that is developing, Mexico's economy in some areas is very strong, some areas it's not strong at all. But as a whole, they're a developing country. They're not developed. So if we place our standards on their workforce or their businesses, they will not be able to compete. Not intellectually or anything like that, but it's going to be difficult to compete because they're just starting these businesses. They're starting these processes. And if the government comes in and says, okay, you got to pay $20 an hour when the average household income is around $25,000 a year, and you want to put $15 an hour, $20 an hour, that's $40,000. So that's not going to happen. If we put our same EPA standards on, they couldn't even get the factories built in 10, 15 years. They spend all their time in legal battles for that. Workers' rights, yeah, they're still developing. And when you have those jobs are very desirable jobs, so you got a lot of people willing to come in and replace the people that walk out. It's not going to change. We can't put our standards on them. There's a picture of individuals when we start getting into the world poverty. There's a picture of a young child is bent forward, face to the ground, hands are in front of the face. The child looks like she's praying, and there's a buzzard right behind her, waiting for her to die. Real picture, real situation. It was in Africa. The photographer ended up killing himself after he won a Pulitzer for the picture. Because he said he had seen all the hell on earth he ever wanted to see. So basically, he said he checked out. But if we want to build up trade and markets in Africa, and there's, like I said, there's developing areas and there's some that are more developed than others. We can't go in there and place our standards on them. Just think about it. If we went back 100 years and applied these same standards to the businesses, most of them would have never gotten off the ground. Standard Oil would have had a terrible time getting off the ground, and so would have a lot of others, because of OSHA, EPA, workers, and so forth. Now, we don't consider them the burden that we used to, and we just accept them. Those are things that have to happen in the developing of our product and services, and where we stand on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. World Trade Organization, like the unilateral approach to achieve free trade, remove all the restrictions. Great Britain, 19th century, Chile and South Korea, recent years. And that's good as long as everybody's playing the same game. If they're not playing the same game, you can't do that. You have the multilateral, but this is the unilateral, just individual countries making agreements to trade. The multilateral will be like we saw with NAFTA. General agreement on tariff and trade, taxes and tariffs, yes, GATT. So these are multilateral. They're involving more than two countries. Not unilateral, one-on-one. These are large groups. The EU would be in here. That was 1993. There were several things that were big issues here, because they had a threshold to qualify for tariff-free. X amount of it had to be produced in Mexico. China and other countries, they started setting up areas in Mexico just to get around the American tariffs. So that had to change. It wasn't as much from Canada, US, it was Mexico. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, continuing series of negotiations among the world countries, promoting free trade, but it has to be free and fair. I can tell you, let's say you're delivering produce with Martinville or whatever I want to name the country, Martinia. And I tell you, the market's open. You want to send your produce here? There'll be no tariffs, there'll be no quotas, there'll be nothing like that. Just go ahead and ship them up. And I can say from that, it is free trade. I don't charge you anything additionally. I don't do anything financially to hold you back. But what may happen is my inspection process of produce coming into Artenia, I may say that the products have to remain in quarantine for 30 days. In essence, what I'm having you do is deliver your products to my ports, and then they're going to sit there and rot before I give them approval to go into the marketplace. Is it free trade? Yes. Is it fair trade? No. So we had to be very careful. When China required that they wanted X number, if you moved over there, they had to know all your company secrets, just about patents, trademarks, everything, to participate in their market. We found out after World War II, reduced average tariffs from 40% to 5%, and it's enforced by the WTO, and that works as long as anybody that's punished by them abides by the rule. Some of the actions that were taken against China, and they were brought by the United States, World Trade Organization, they were on our side, they ruled in our favor, but China just said, heck with it, sue me. Advantage of multilateral, we can have freer trade. Unilateral, we have trade restrictions just to protect us and that other country. We will have better pricing, the more people that are involved. Because like we talked about earlier on in the textbook about comparative and absolute advantage, we can have an absolute advantage on everything, but we can't have comparative advantage on all. Now we have a political advantage going with the World Trade Organizations. The producers are fewer and better organized. There's greater political influence to some degree. And now we've reached the end of this chapter. Like I said, but when we started chapter 7, all of these seem to work together. If we look at the graphing, let me go to the other one. We can see that this just one takes up after the other. We had the consumer producer surplus, and we went into taxes, and then we went into world prices, and then we added a tariff to the equation. Shouldn't see anything where there's export taxes on the test or on the homework. But if we did place an export tax, it'd be on the top side. Because we wouldn't want to put an export tax on something where the world price is that much lower. We gain our advantage with export taxes on products where the world price is greater than domestic. Okay. Questions about chapter 7, 8, and 9?